Hi there, welcome back. So now you know how RDF schema works, how to define classes, instances, properties, domain and range and so on. So this is all that you need for defining your own vocabulary. Remember in the beginning, I told you that people often call this slightly differently, sometimes a schema, sometimes vocabulary, sometimes ontology. But the point is we define the semantics for a domain so that we can interpret the instances, the data in a knowledge graph in the same way. So let's talk about some more practical consideration for these vocabularies. Remember, one of the goals was we use knowledge graphs for knowledge integration. You want to overcome these information silos where you have bits and pieces distributed over multiple databases or other pieces of knowledge storage. And you need a way to integrate them. So this only works using knowledge graphs if you agree on a shared vocabulary. So for example, very often you have to describe people. You have to define the name, the email, and other information about people. So now you could make your own vocabulary using what you just learned. You could define classes and properties and domain and range and call it my person vocabulary. And then somebody else could again write their own vocabulary for describing names and emails and call it differently. And now you have these two graphs described using two different vocabularies, and you don't really have a way to connect these two graphs because they have a different vocabulary. You could only match nodes based on the URI, but not on the semantics like names and emails. So there is a major rule when you work on knowledge graphs and knowledge bases that you reuse vocabularies wherever possible. For example, one very common use case is describing persons with names, emails, and so on. And there is a schema called FOAF, which I'll show you in a minute. And then you just use always the same schema. You don't make up your own. There is a second rule. Let's say you can't use an existing vocabulary because you're doing something for the first time. There is nothing that exists for describing it. Then there is a way to make your data self-describing. And I'll show you this one first. So what's meant by a self-describing data set? Let's say you have to define a new term that doesn't exist in any vocabulary. In the example here, that's small, medium enterprise. Now, this is something that definitely exists because SMEs are a very common term, but let's just assume for this example that this is something you made up. So now you define in your RDFS, you define this new class, small, medium enterprise. Yeah, you can see, like we just learned, this is a class. So now if this were all that you provide, that this is a class, then another system, another AI, wouldn't really know what this is. Yeah, it knows that it's a class, but you can't really interpret the instances that's using this class. But you can make it self-describing by adding additional information. And this is what you see here. So first we have a label. Remember, you should add a label for the human user to explain what it is. But now we are adding references to other existing classes. For example, in DBpedia, DBpedia also has a vocabulary, which you find under DBpedia ontology, and there it has a company. So you can say this is a subclass of company, a specific type of company. And now another AI that reads triples described using this vocabulary, it might not know small, medium enterprise, but it knows that the instances are a subclass, a kind of company. And you are not limited to linking it to just one existing vocabulary. You can link it to multiple existing vocabularies. So over time, you'll learn about existing vocabularies and what they describe, but here are a couple of more. Freebase, OpenPsych, UMBL, and In one, there is a business. Here, there's just an ID of a concept, and similar here. So essentially, when you define a new term, you should reference existing terms, for example, with subclass or other relationships, so that an automated AI reading your knowledge graph can make some inferences, has some knowledge about the information you described there. So the other part was the first rule, and this is really important: reuse vocabularies whenever possible. So when you want to describe your data, you want to put it into a knowledge graph, you first should look at, are there existing vocabularies that cover the information that I want to model? And the way to go about it in practice is, first, you just have to know some of these standard vocabularies. Yeah, this is just like in programming, you know some of these standard libraries. And then there are search engines that help you to find specific vocabularies. Roughly, you can distinguish the core vocabularies. So some of the vocabularies that are used everywhere. And then there are some authoritative vocabularies that are widely maintained and also used by a lot of people. In terms of programming, you could think about, let's say you're using Java, and then you're not redefining your own collection classes like a list or a set and so on. You don't write this from scratch. You're just using the Java collections interface. So just like the core vocabularies, in Java, you would have the collections classes and interfaces. And then if that's not enough, you would use some standard libraries like the Apache libraries for string manipulation and other tasks. That would be somewhat similar to the authoritative vocabularies. And only if you can't find anything in the existing libraries and the existing vocabularies, then you create your own vocabulary. And if you do it, you're using RDFS, what we just learned. There's also another standard that we're not going to cover much in this course. This is OWL, which has some more advanced modeling features. But then if you're publishing your data using your new vocabulary, this is something you have to maintain. So just like writing your own library that you publish with your code that you have to maintain, you then have to maintain this new library. So let's look at some of these core vocabularies. What I mentioned before is describing people. So FOAF is one of the most widely used vocabularies for this. And vCard, you might know this from calendar invitations, has a somewhat limited feature set, but is also widely used. If you want to name things, well, you can start with RDFS label. If the thing is a person, you can use FOAF name, and later we'll see SKOS as another way to name things. Addresses, use vCard. For projects, any type of project, not just a software project, there is a vocabulary called DOPE, description of a project. For web pages, publications, books, articles, and so on, you have seen the DC one, the Dublin core. So there are a couple of properties and classes in there, creator, description, and so on. If you have a vocabulary and want to describe the vocabulary, there's the VOID vocabulary. So for making a vocabulary self-describing. And for taxonomies, what I showed you in the introduction, and I'll talk about this in more detail in a minute, there is this SKOS vocabulary. Let's look at one of them. So I mentioned FOAF, the friend of a friend vocabulary, is essentially used for modeling people together with their name, things like their email, and for especially the relationships between one person and other persons. So if you want to define a social network kind of setup, then you're using FOAF for this. So note here that the syntax is in RDF XML, don't get confused. Now, to practice a bit of working with FOAF, there is another task on the worksheet. Task number 1, the last one for this week. So here you'll have to check out FOAF online, and you have to describe 2 pieces of information. For our Joe that we used a few times, you have to add this information about the photo, and for Jane, you have to add the information about the age. And then when you're done, I'll see you in the next lecture part. See you then.